Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Target Smart podcast brought to you by Target Smart and the Terra Group companies. I'm your host, Albert Morales. Please remember to send us your questions, thoughts, ideas for our upcoming episodes on anything related to data, such as voter registration trends, polling trends we're seeing, specific campaigns, or guests you would like us to bring on the show. This podcast is all about lifting up the partners we work with across the country. In the coming weeks and months, you will be hearing from members of the Target Smart team, candidates, elected officials, campaign managers, and party leaders, all of them eager to share how their respective campaigns are going. Please remember to subscribe to the Target Smart podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen, and YouTube. You can email the show at the Target Smart Podcast at targetsmart.com. That's the Target Smart Podcast at targetsmart.com. Now, I am pleased to introduce our next guest. Tom, you're a man who needs no introduction, so I'm going to go ahead and cut to the chase and get right to it. So throughout our segment, I'm going to do my best to walk our audience through the chronology of a recent tweet of yours that you put out on X and other platforms regarding the second anniversary of the Dobbs decision, a day that upended the lives of women across the country. So you start by reminding folks of how abortion rights became the most powerful single issue in politics, and that it is likely more salient now than it was in 2022. Can you explain yourself a little bit, and as we dissect your tweet as we go along here?
Yeah, I'd love to. And it's great to be back on with you here. I think this is the first podcast I've done about a tweet thread, but there's a lot in here. So I'm looking forward to talking about it because as folks probably know,
it's worthy.
Well, and it's challenging sometimes to put all of your thoughts together in less than 280 characters. So I'm thankful to have the opportunity to expand on this. I mean, what I'm talking about here is I think there has been this open question from that moment, June 24th, 2022, where the Dobbs decision was handed down, of what impact is it likely to have? And people have debated this back and forth. People continue to debate it. But what I've seen in the evidence is I think few people would debate the power that it had, electorally speaking, in the 2022 elections. It had a huge impact. But then there's some people who think, is that still the case? And as I'll talk about in this thread, as we'll talk about in this conversation, I've seen a lot of evidence that suggests that it's actually more powerful of a political and organizing force now than it was in the 2022 cycle, which is, a bit of a hot take, but something that I'm confident in at this point. And I hope folks will share my opinion once we go through this a little bit.
So I think you're speaking to the fact that 1 in 3 women in this country are now affected by it, whereas in 2022 was still kind of new and women weren't really feeling it. I think there was a shock element to it, but I don't think I think Texas is a great example, right?
Yeah, I think there's shock and there's denial. We are humans. We are all humans, and this is something that had existed for almost 50 years at the point that the Republican and conservative controlled Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. And so I think for a lot of us, it was natural to sort of be in that moment and think, well, okay, but it can't actually be this bad. Someone will do something. Surely Republicans wouldn't go this far. And what we found in this experience is that they've actually gone further, that they've attacked things like in vitro fertilization, that they are criminalizing basic healthcare, that women are having to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles just to get life-saving care. That if you live in the South, you are nowhere close to the type of care you need just to be able, in some cases, to have a healthy child, even if an abortion isn't something that you need or desire. And so this landscape has become so much more horrifying, for lack of a better word, for Americans, that this lived experience, the 2 years of lived experience, I think for most people, and sure, there are those people who didn't have that level of optimism, but I think a lot of us had that level of optimism that perhaps things couldn't be that bad, and the lived reality has been, no, it's been much worse.
Yeah, I mean, you and I are both girl dads, and I know for us anyway, we're not entertaining any colleges or universities in the South with these archaic laws. They're just I don't care how good a school they are, but my wife and I are pretty non-negotiable on that.
We've had the same conversations. I think a lot of Americans find themselves in that same position, unfortunately.
Yeah. So I was, let's talk about Kansas a little bit. The state that, per your tweet, would give us a first glimpse into how the issue would begin to play out. And you mentioned that there was only one public opinion poll, I think, at the time on the constitutional amendment and how it would play out. So, and it was close. So I think that sort of, raised everybody's eyebrow a little bit. But to those in the audience who are not as familiar with the failed amendment, it would have removed protections of abortion rights in Kansas, of all places. I think we've all read that book, What's the Matter with Kansas? We were all shocked. But how shocked were you or weren't you? That campaign seemed to, it's not like, people were talking about it and writing about it, but it seemed like it came within, it was here and gone before we knew it.
Yeah, it did. I think for a lot of people, it snuck up on them because it was something that was planned. As I mentioned in the tweet thread here, Kansas was sort of picked by the foes of abortion rights to be this sort of perfect place to, if we entered this post-Dobbs environment as they anticipated when they planned this, or post-Roe environment, they figured Kansas as this, as you say, this sort of prototypical Republican state would be the best place to sort of move forward, knowing that the Dobbs decision would likely just sort of remove the federal protections. And then in the end, the issue would be settled by the states. And so, like you said, there was just that one poll. I don't think it was getting a lot of attention at that point. It was still, let's keep in mind, this was about 5 weeks after the Dobbs decision when everyone was still reeling, just trying to figure out what it meant and what the actual impact would be. This would be the first electoral test. And this one poll showed it very close, neither side breaking 50%. And so, personally, I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea what to expect. I'm not sure many people could have felt confident at that point about any outcome. And then, there we have it. This tweet here was something that sort of burned into my memory because for those who know Dave Wasserman, very astute political analyst, even though I'll disagree with him sometimes. And he has this almost branded at this point refrain when he's looking at races and he's ready to call it one way or another. He says, "I've seen enough." And I was just, I just happened to be on a quiet summer Tuesday night looking through Twitter and seeing, I didn't expect to see any results from Kansas yet. The polls had just closed not that long ago. And I saw this. I checked out, I said, what the heck? How was this race not only, called, but like it had to have been such a wide margin for Wasserman to be able to call it at that point. That told me, well, that was not what I was expecting. I can confidently say that I didn't expect such a wide margin either way. In the end, it ended up being about an 18-point margin, which to me was the first sign that if we had questions up to that point about how would abortion impact elections, this was the first sign that we were living in a very different political environment than we were prior to Dobbs. Dobbs indeed had changed everything.
Yeah, ironically, the guy who was taking a bullhorn to this issue was James Carville, not exactly the favorite on most women in progressive politics these days.
It's true.
But that's all he would talk about for like a month going into this. And he was, that's Carville. But anyway,
it's very true.
So, so your next observation, I think, turn heads, including yours truly. You started digging through the numbers and you found that I think 70% of new registrants in Kansas leading up to the vote were women. Is And
Yeah. This, I mean, Albert, this is like one of those stats because you and I have worked in this business for a long time. And when you're dealing with election data, like if you see a little bit of movement from past precedent or the norm, meaning a few points, that's a huge deal. Like we in the campaign world operate within the margins. We're about making small differences that win campaigns. And you don't see numbers like this. And so at that point, again, it was election night. It was the day after. And I was still kind of amazed by that margin to see an 18-point margin in favor of abortion rights in Kansas. And so, we weren't going to have the vote history that would tell us who actually voted in the election for a while. It takes a while for that, so folks know. But what we do have is the voter file. The Target Smart voter file is updated on a very regular basis. And so I was able to go in and look. Registration deadline for that Kansas primary was mid-July. So you really only had about a 3-week period between June 24th, when Dobbs was handed down, and when you had to be registered in order to participate in that primary. About a 3-week period. And so I looked at, well, who is registering that? Because if you look at voter registration, and it's the sort of analysis that we're always doing, especially at this point in elections, to see which side has the intensity. You look at who's registering. And I ran the count, and the first thing I saw was that almost 70% of the people who had registered to vote in that period were women. And they were overwhelmingly young women. You generally don't see a lot of interest and enthusiasm in a otherwise low-key, low-stakes primary election. This wasn't low stakes. This was all the stakes. But again, for a typical Kansas summer primary election, you would see not much registration, not high turnout. And that wasn't what we saw. So I literally, I was convinced I'd made an error because I'm not nearly as good as our data team and the folks who have hands on the data all the time. So I thought it was an error. Yeah, if you see this chart here, we can scroll this chart. That shows it. So I literally threw the data in Excel. I'm not a data viz guy either. We have great people at that. That's not me, but I love to. It's become like, yeah, look. And thank God we work with great people who can do much better than this. But for me, it's like when I'm digging in data, I like to be able to visualize it. So I just threw the data in Excel, and you see this. So like it shows the sort of regular trend where you have little fluctuations where it's 50%, 52, 53. That's pretty normal. You had the leak, and even when it leaked in May, you had a surge of women registering of a few points, and then Dobbs happens and it just skyrockets, where suddenly 7 out of 10 new registrants are women. And that was, in a way, the second sign. It was the first explanation of what happened in Kansas.
Yep.
And it was the first sign that, this is really mobilizing voters, especially women, especially young women. And that's how it happened. It's that simple.
Yeah. So looking, with Kansas now in the rear view mirror, you start to look at the next fight or fights. And I think the next ones were special elections, or in the form of special elections. Alaska, New York come to mind.
I mean, even before that, it was, and this is just like a very simple chart I did here. The first question I had was, before we got those specials, it was a question of like, well, are we seeing registration spikes elsewhere? Like Kansas, it made sense because there was this constitutional amendment, but were women in other states registering at a higher rate at that point? Because again, it was so close to it. We just had a few states that had updated in the last, during that period. So I looked at them, and the answer was generally yes. The spikes weren't nearly as big as Kansas, which makes sense. But then also there was the flip side of that coin, which I think is important in this conversation, that like New York, you didn't see any increase, which kind of makes sense. If you were a New Yorker, you were generally at that point,
you feel safe.
Yeah, you might be concerned about the issue, but you don't feel like I have to run out and vote to change this because, your elected officials in New York are supporting abortion rights. So there's not that same sense of urgency. Whereas in Kansas, if you don't do that, you're literally going to lose protections, and the next day abortion rights could be removed. So that was the next thing. And then to your point, the question was for me, okay, well, we saw it in the constitutional amendment. We've seen it in voter registration in some of these states. But when people are voting for a Democrat versus a Republican, will they make that connection? Like, will Democratic candidates do better because of this issue? And the first test we had was that New York 19 special election. It's in upstate New York. not an awful district, but also not like the best Democratic district. And you had a Democratic candidate who just, I said this here, I think here, that he ran fearlessly on the issue. And we've seen this. Again, we've seen this for years where Democrats, there were times, especially in these types of districts, maybe felt like they couldn't lean in on the issue. Yeah. And he just went for it. And he told people after the race that his win was about abortion, that he made it a referendum on abortion rights. Now, again, this is in New York, the state that didn't see that surge. But what we saw was if a candidate could connect his race and specifically voting in this race about abortion rights and point to his Republican opponent and say, these are the people who did this. And if you elect more Republicans, they're going to make this national. And it was effective there. We won there. As you mentioned a second ago, we then won in Alaska. Mary Peltola won somewhat improbably in Alaska, by no means a Democratic state. I think at that point, sort of nationally, Democrats and the media, the talking heads, looked at this and said, wow, okay, yeah, everything has changed. We're sold. Dobbs changed everything. We thought it was going to be a red wave election, but look at these special elections in August. Look at the Kansas election. Things are going to be different. That's where people were. And then, as we'll talk about in a second, that didn't last long, unfortunately.
Remind me again. Did we get outspent in Kansas on that?
I don't know. That's a great question.
I don't remember that.
I don't know. I mean, I don't. My sense was at the point that you didn't have massive resources flowing there yet. There was some organizing, but again, this all happened very quickly.
Yeah, it did. Let me see if I can pull up the next tweet here. So we can move along. Let's see.
Well, this one, I was just a quick aside. I was gratified to be asked by the folks at the New York Times if I would write an op-ed about what we were seeing, and to me, this was sort of the crest of the wave of people looking at the issue and believing that would change things. In this notion that there was going to be a red wave election. This was in early September. People were buying it at that point. Yes, it's going to change everything. And again, it didn't last long. I mean, we can go ahead to the next one. It was very soon after this that bad polling reared its ugly head and really changed the environment in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, I mean, independent women in that poll that you referenced, the bad poll, the independent women who'd given Democrats, I think, a 14-point margin in September survey.
Yeah.
Had supposedly swung to give the GOP just the opposite. I think an 18-point advantage. Did any of this materialize on election day?
No. I mean, you sound like a prosecutor, and you're right. I mean, you've worked in polling, right? You know this. And subgroups can be noisy in polls. Sure.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be this noisy. And if they are, you shouldn't write stories about it, which I included in this tweet thread, a link to the story. And I even screen grabbed the actual quote because the New York Times, they could have looked at this and said, okay, well, this is noisy subgroup data. It's small subgroups, and independents especially, they're harder to sample accurately. So you might, in one poll, have a too conservative subgroup of independents, and the next poll, you might have a too liberal subgroup. That happens. It's hard because you don't have anything to weight against there, really. And that's almost certainly what happened. And instead of them just sort of looking at that and saying, yeah, that's the kind of thing you see at the subgroup level, we shouldn't really elevate this, they started writing stories about it. They started going on cable news and talking about it, saying, look, Democrats overplayed their hands on abortion. They talked about abortion too much. They didn't talk about the economy, inflation, crime, immigration. In reality, we know Democrats were talking about all of those things, including abortion rights, that we're capable of walking and chewing gum. But they created this caricature just to explain a bad poll. And that became incredibly disruptive in a lot of ways because this was people's default. As if we'll remember, going into this election, everyone thought Republicans were going to win, red wave, because of all the historic precedent for midterm elections. And this poll sort of confirmed that. And when a poll confirms your priors, you're not going to be skeptical of it. At least the political establishment wasn't. And so the red wave was back on. Everyone was convinced, okay, Dobbs just had an impact. we had a nice run for a few weeks in August, but reality setting in. Smart people like Nate Silver and Nate Cohn were out there saying this is what happens. Look, it reverts back to the quote fundamentals, and Republicans are going to go and they're going to take back the House. They're going to take back the Senate. They're going to win up and down the ballot. That was the thinking at this point.
I was having this conversation with the friend the other day. She was, it's hard to describe the rage I think they're feeling. And as someone who in a previous life had my fair share of misunderstandings with some women in my life, I can tell you that there is, it's Shakespearean, right? Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. And I think we've gotten to a point where they just shut down and they don't want to talk about it. And I think whether it's a book club or, name any normal gathering of women throughout the country, I think they're happening right now. I think they're just organizing below the radar. And I don't know that you are going to uncover this in a focus group or even a survey, because I just don't think they volunteer that information. And I'm always skeptical of these cable news programs who bring on quote unquote independents or undecideds. I have a hard time. I've seen enough focus groups now to draw the following conclusion. I think the real undecided voters, they're usually hermits, right? They sort of stay in their cocoon and they come out on election day. They're not out there publishing for the world to see, oh yes, well, I'm undecided. I know for a fact they're hook, line, and sinker for whatever, name the candidate, right? And so it to my point, I guess it's just very difficult to understand some of this and where we're headed in November. I think it's just a perfect storm that continues to brew. So moving on to your tweet here, I guess it's hard to for the average listener who doesn't follow campaigns and elections the way we do for a living to understand how this all plays out. I mean, you would think that miss would have generated a big story, right? Like a 60 Minutes like story, because the narrative, across the board was, this Democrats are in for another shellacking in 22, and it did not materialize. Nobody talked about it. It was like, okay, we missed. Let's move along now. Focus on 2024. But I'm curious your thoughts on this, Tom. Do you see like an opening for like an ombudsman of polling of sorts in the near future? Because if 538 is the standard, we're kind of screwed. I mean, it's my understanding that they rate pollsters based on some self-reporting process or mechanism. Can you explain to our audience what we mean by this?
Yeah, I can, and I don't have the exact optimism that it's going to change. And you mentioned the idea of a polling ombudsman, and I think that'd be a great idea. The best potential for that would be like
one can dream.
Yeah, right. It would be like the 538s or New York Times of the world in how they present the polls, but that's not happening. And so, what 538 does is they look at the pollsters and how close their late polls in an election cycle matched up to the actual results, and then they give them accuracy grades. It's more complicated than that. They weight it by different things, but that's the general notion of what they are doing. And the problem is, and this was really buried to your point, where this error happened, and it wasn't, not only was it not sort of recognized and internalized and dealt with, it was swept under the rug. And in the end, people talked about the polls in 2022 about how great they were and how accurate they were. 538 wrote a piece where the headline was actually the polls in 2022 were historically accurate. That's literally the headline of the piece. In what happened, Nate Cohn, again, someone I respected, he does smart analysis. He's the chief election analyst for the New York Times. He gave a talk at, I think it was UC Berkeley, months after the election. And, it just happened to be online. And because I'm that kind of person, I watched it. I don't think many people saw this. No offense to Nate, he's a great speaker, but it's just not the kind of thing most people are spending a lot of time watching. And in his talk, he referred to that error that we were talking about a moment ago. Not just that one poll error, but the poll errors in general that showed, if you asked people what the most important issue was, it showed that abortion was dropping. And that's what led to people saying abortion had faded as an issue. He referred to that error in the New York Times polls and other people's polls as an error in line with the error in the 2016 presidential race, when all the polls said with great certainty that Hillary Clinton was going to beat Donald Trump. That's what he said. And I agree with him on that. He's right. But the problem is no one has acted as if that was the case. In fact, again, we look at it and just say, well, no, the polls were historically accurate. Well, the polls missed in Senate races by an average of 4.9%. The polls in 2020 in the presidential race missed by an average of 5%. No one looked at the polls in 2020, again, that suggested that President Biden was going to win easily in a landslide. No one looked at that and said, oh, those polls were great. The polls were bad in 2020. They were. So the fact that the polls in Senate races in 2022 were just 0.1% better, we look at that and we say, well, this is great. The reality is polls are a great tool for people who know how to use them. But the idea that we can use them to perfectly predict what's happening, to perfectly predict who's going to win, and to perfectly predict what people care about. When we're doing this, when we're doing our polling, our team, and you had Ben Lazarus on in a great episode, if people haven't seen it, I recommend that they do. So he talks a lot about this sort of thing. But in the end, we're not asking those simplistic type of questions that you see in these media surveys to figure out what is actually motivating voters. I think that was the biggest problem. It's flawed. It's a flawed framework. But I don't see that lesson having been learned. And I don't have a lot of optimism that things will change anytime soon on that front, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, toward the end of your tweet, you write about, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but here we are 2 years later. There's little to celebrate in the post-Dobbs hellscape, where millions of women remain deprived of a fundamental human right thanks to Donald Trump, blah, blah. But there's also hope. And you also write that this is why I'm confident about, or confident that abortion rights will be even more salient in the 24 elections. And those who run on the right side of the issue will stand to win, or have a better chance at winning. Aside from the fact that the polls aren't destiny, what thought do you want to leave our audience with as it relates to, polling in this specific issue?
To me, the lesson from 2022, from 2020 and before, and what we figure out, and the reason why, and we talked about this a little bit the last time we spoke, but why we, I guess, were more accurate and didn't see what other people were seeing, is that we were widening the aperture and we were looking at other data. We were looking at that voter registration data that you shared in Kansas and elsewhere. We were looking at early vote data. We were looking at special election results. That's number one. Use poll as a tool, but it's a tool among many other tools. And if you're smart about this, you're using all those tools together. When you look at 2020, 2024 and what we've seen, we've seen the special election at the beginning of this year in the George Santos district, where Democrats ran heavily on that issue, among other issues, and won. Didn't just win, but won easily by 7 points in a much more competitive district. I think Democrats have learned to run on this issue, to put it in the forefront, to make sure that voters are aware of the stakes. I believe you will see that in this election. I want to be clear about something. Abortion rights and Dobbs, it's not a magic wand. It doesn't just magically win races for Democrats. That's why we saw in 2022, we did really well in some places and we didn't do as well in other places, because the stakes weren't clear. Again, I think we've gotten better at it, but people whose expectations that abortion rights will just win us the White House for another term, that will let us hold on to the Senate and the House, it doesn't work like that. The campaigns have to do the work. I'm confident that our campaigns are even smarter about it and better about it than they were 2 years ago, but it's still going to be a battle.
Yeah. On that note, we or at least I try to go out of my way in every segment to remind folks that we have been winning just about every meaningful election since 2018. This predates the Dobbs decision, to your point. So there's something else there. What that it is, I don't quite know yet. I do know that we have had our share of losses, particularly in 22 when we had those losses in New York. But I think a lot of that was candidate quality, to be sure. And I think this go around, we've seen some very top tier candidates emerge from these competitive primaries.
And if I can, I think what happened going back to 2018 is there has been, a credit to the American people, a rejection of Republican extremism and the type of extremist, unqualified candidates that they've been nominating. People like Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania and Herschel Walker in Georgia, and the list goes on and on and on. I think that's a big part of why Democrats have been overperforming and Republicans have been underperforming. It's not magic, and it's not going to win us every race everywhere. But Dobbs was just this great truth, this awful truth, and was great in terms of magnitude, awful in terms of impact, where it underscored for people just how extremist the Republican Party is. And that's why I think it took narratives that maybe weren't working before, like January 6th, and it really consolidated those. And you saw this broader narrative on Republican extremism becoming even more effective. And I think that's only strengthening.
Yeah, don't forget our secret weapon, Donald Trump. It's like deja vu all over again. He keeps meddling in these primaries, and he ends up with these nut jobs that just have zero chance at winning in November.
Absolutely,
whether it's Arizona or name the state. But anyway, we'll leave that one for another day. That's one of my roosters signaling to me that it is lunchtime and they want their midday snack.
I love it. Same with me.
Tom, you're always a great guest, and you're always welcome on this podcast. We look forward to having you here again soon as these other primaries settle. I'd like to remind folks that we have primaries all the way through, what is it? We have Delaware in September, right? We have Delaware. Right. That's post-convention. So a lot of this stuff isn't settling, and I know there's some unsettling going on this morning, but we will prevail. On that note, I will bid you farewell, Tom, and thank you all for tuning in today. I'm your host, Albert Morales. Don't forget to send your questions or ideas for our upcoming podcasts on topics or guests you would like to learn more about. Please remember to subscribe to the Target Smart podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you listen, and on YouTube. And until next week, this has been the Target Smart podcast with your host, Albert Morales. And our guest today was Tom Bonier, our leader in chief. Thank you all.